Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, we've got quite the video ready for us today. It's about how we need to talk about signature weapons across gacha games. And I think that this would be a great video for us to watch because Wuthering Waves is actually included in the thumbnail, and the discussion about signature weapons and the boost that they provide, well, it's been something that's been occurring in the Wuwa community for quite a while. Because a lot of people have some complaints about how some of the signatures are designed and how they might be a little bit too hyper specific, especially in relation to other units on the especially in relation to like a unit's damage type, and the performance with it is a lot higher than their performance without it. And so that's some of the basis that we have going into this. Why don't we take a look at this vid? It's got 11k views from a 500 to 600 sub channel. And if you're not familiar with how YouTube works, that must mean that they were cooking. So why don't we go ahead, get right on into it, and see what this creator has to say.
Signature weapon systems are inherently predatory. At their core, they're an excuse to profit off yet another limited item with their exclusivity, adding an extra layer of FOMO to an already morally questionable genre.
Okay, so first things first, I don't think this is AI. I think this is a real person. And second, good, but they need some background music.
But why do modern gachas still implement such a system? Is it becoming more problematic? And if they are, how? To understand the situation of today, it's important to break down the weapon system as a whole regarding modern gachas. In these games, notably the ones known as the Big Four, it is standard for characters to not only be categorized by element, but also by weapon type.
Can we also talk about the model? I think the model's actually pretty good as well, but unfortunately, it's too small on the screen. I feel like we gotta get it closer, zoomed up, and maybe see less of the wings. Okay, enough critiques though. But yeah, solid stuff, just some slight tweaks.
For example, in both Genshin and Wuthering Waves, this is directly expressed by different weapons such as swords, guns, polearms, and many more. Each character is assigned a weapon they are tied to. A sword character is locked to only using swords, and gun characters may only wield guns.
And then in games like, your Honkai Star Rails or your ZZZs, you've got your light cones and your disk drives that, well, not as visually clear what's attached to what, but you just gotta look at the labels, right?
In Honkai Star Rail, weaponry is replaced with paths, and characters can only equip light cones that match their path. Zenless Zone Zero takes a similar approach where agent type must match the type of the W engine they equip, else they lose all the weapon's special effects. While weapon classification systems do allow for a variety in gacha games, creating uniqueness among characters, the way these systems are executed is predatory, both limiting the amount of potential weapons a character would have access to, as well as creating an artificial need for more monetized content. This, of course, is the signature weapon. Gacha games operate on limited time banners. A character is available for a few weeks via in-game currency, which can also be purchased with real money. Afterwards, they're replaced with a new character, and the cycle repeats. This system is designed to create FOMO, as missing out could mean waiting months or even years for the character to rerun. Of course, these games are mapped out such that they're free to play or even a moderate spender.
Something that would have helped a lot are some visuals for what's going on, but it looks like they get into the visuals later. Okay, so this is just a bit of like an intro.
Won't obtain enough currency to reliably pull even a single copy of each character, incentivizing players to spend real money to make up for that difference.
I think everything that they're saying is entirely spot on. As a whole, weapons being separate from a character and having a weapon banner in the first place is inherently predatory, because everything you know about a game is going to tell you that a character is not going to be able to perform at their maximum potential, or they're not going to be feeling like the full unit unless you pull their weapon as well. And that's just something that's going to occur across pretty much every game that has a weapon system in the first place. And games that don't have one are inherently going to be, to some degree, less predatory, because you always have to get the full product in those games. Naturally, there are dupes as well, but you also have to think about it from the perspective of like the pull income too, where the games that don't have a weapon and you get the full strength character just with one pull or one guarantee, those games typically end up having less currency or lower rates.
While I do enjoy gacha games myself despite this, it's undeniable that this system is easily abused and is why the genre carries such a bad reputation. But what if I told you it doesn't end there? That there's another, entirely separate piece of the puzzle needed to complete the already hard-to-obtain character. This is where signature weapons come in. Along with the limited character banner, there's a separate weapon banner running concurrently that shares the same currency. These weapons are designed with the intention to synergize perfectly with the corresponding character, often offering exceptional boosts compared to other non-limited options. Now, SIGs do have the merit of showing dedication to a character and an avenue to further strengthen them if desired, but considering how expensive a character is to obtain by itself, averaging around a couple hundred or so US dollars, tying power.
It's not that low. I think this is the funny thing. Even in this video where we're getting critical about the weapon system or we're getting critical about gacha game monetization, we actually lowballed how much it costs for a character completely. If you look in and you see like a Genshin Impact banner nowadays, they'll tell you that the range of expenditures goes from $1.98 to almost $500 for pulling a character. I believe the total is like $478 or something like that. So she is lowballing the hell out of it when it comes to the maximum potential cost. It's maybe 100 with a top-up reset.
Power to an additional, almost just as pricey weapon makes things messy fast. It's alarmingly common, especially for more recently released units, to have a character overly reliant on their signature weapon, which can manifest in a multitude of ways. The simplest way is just to have an insane difference in numbers between the signature and the free-to-play or non-limited alternative. This is fairly common, to name a few: Hoshimi Miyabi.
See that first one? Ooh, that's a little rough. Yeah, I think that this is because Hoshimi Miyabi was intentionally designed this way. She's an anomaly character that goes in and deals critical damage. There is no other anomaly character like that in the game. She's an anomaly character that's built like an attack one. And so, because of this whole classification, right, and the inability to share gear or share W edges across classes, it causes an issue with her gearing 1,000,000% if you do not have her sig.
Miyabi, Evelyn Chevalier, Hugo Vlad, Sani, and Maide are all characters that have been released in the last half year or so that suffer from this problem.
I mean, when we look at the numbers that we were just looking at before, 23% doesn't look that bad. I probably would have used Brant instead.
In the last half year or so that suffer from this problem. The more common way to create a reliance on signature weapons is to design characters that have features of their kits tied to their sig that are otherwise unobtainable.
A lot of people in chat right now are getting into the whole gacha rate conversation. I think the take right now is simply looking at this from a bit more of like a general point of view of how weapons as a whole work. And I'm pretty certain she's going to get into like a breakdown of the different ways that developers have integrated the system in their games. You have games like ZZZ and Honkai Star Rail and Genshin Impact that frankly have no business having a chance to lose on their weapon banner. They have no business having that system in the game. There's no justification at all for having a 75-25 or whatever system Genshin Impact has in the game, because weapons as a whole are so much less in terms of what actual type of content they are. Weapons as a whole, especially in a game like HSR, it's literally a PNG that changes your character stats versus a whole new fucking unit with a whole new kit. At least in a game like Wuthering Waves, the weapon has like a different model and stuff. You don't even see that in HSR, and you barely see it in ZZZ. And so at least this system guarantees you the weapon in Wuthering Waves, at the very least.
Trigger's W engine is not only a massive damage boost from the next best option, but also contains a sizable defense shred.
And this is one of the huge reasons why Zenless Zone Zero, in my opinion, absolutely should not have a 75-25. This weapon straight up reduces a target's defense by 25% if Trigger is using it. No other character on the roster is able to access this effect. This effectively is a part of Trigger's kit put into the weapon. It is literally something that Trigger should have in her baseline kit, and it's not there. Some could say that Lupa's signature is somewhat similar in that vein, because Lupa's signature gives a 24% fusion damage bonus to all resonators in the team, right? Unfortunately, if you try to draw a comparison between this weapon, which I do think it is, I don't really like this weapon effect. I wish it said general attribute damage instead. I wish it buffed everyone's damage by 24%. This is a buff. This 24% fusion buff that Lupa has on her weapon, it's already something that's in her kit at a baseline. She already has so many buffs that will buff damage, buff fusion damage specifically, and then also reduce fusion resistance on the enemies as well. And so this is just like more damage on a character that already has the damage buffs in her kit. This, on the other hand, is access to a completely different mechanic, a different way of buffing the team's damage output that Trigger just doesn't have in the first place. And it feels like it got separated out from her kit. This is not adding more to what the unit has. This is locking a feature of the unit behind a limited weapon. And that's what makes some signature weapon systems in some of the games so legitimately awful. It's not about making what the character does and then increasing their ability to do it. It's about unlocking an entirely new mechanic.
Feature that arguably should be in her base kit. Aglaya's signature light cone gives base speed, and equipping it is the only way to viably unlock her strongest playstyle, in which she becomes fast enough to lap Sunday twice.
And that's kind of the shitty part. It's when you do this, where the character plays entirely differently, having their weapon versus not. And you want to know what the issue is with this, ladies and gentlemen? This would be like if Zani's blaze was tied to her weapon. At least in Zani's case, there's potential. There's a future where there's a new Spectrofrazzle character released. You can still get her numbers up with Rover, but there's a new Spectrofrazzle character released that's like an A-, a B+ version of Phoebe. And then that's a budget way to get that whole that whole team comp going. Imagine if Zani's Spectrofrazzle application or her blaze was tied to her weapon. That is what the weapons in these Hoyoverse games are starting to become. You literally will lose their ability to actually use their kit properly without pulling on the signature as well. And don't worry, there are still plenty more examples in HSR when it comes to this dynamic.
Brand's signature sword is the only sword in the game that allows him to run his ideal echo set, meaning if you don't spend currency for a sig, you're effectively locked out of optimal equipment.
Unfortunately, this is a little bit of misinformation. Not too bad, but I think it's Wuthering Waves being brought here into the conversation when it probably shouldn't be. Brand's weapon is really, really good on him. Unfortunately, he also has several viable alternatives that we're already listing out over here, and fundamentally, they don't change the way he plays. Overture, the 4-star weapon that she's talking about over here, lets him use his best in slot set. Absolutely. That is 100% true. Overture lets him do that. You do less damage with Overture than you do with this signature. Makes sense to me. She mentions here how you can run Emerald of Genesis with Molten Rift instead. That only works in one of his teams, his hyper carry lineup. And so, instead of viewing this as, oh, his damage is so bad with Overture, the 4-star option compared to his signature, it's more so like, oh, even if I don't have his signature, I have a viable way to play Brant in a hyper carry lineup using Emerald of Genesis and Molten Rift. That's kind of the difference between the two, is that the character, yes, won't be able to use their best in slot set with the best overall whatever, but they're still going to be able to, if you want higher damage output, play it in a different way. So you can do the baseline style where you do less damage with Overture, or you go the Molten Rift hypercarry style, do more damage, but then lose a lot of ER. So you have to dedicate more field time to him. And so it's a matter of like, you don't lose any of your ability to play these teams. You don't lose any of it at all based off the signature weapon. It's just, you know, different ways to do the damage. But yeah, no lapping, you know, base speed shenanigans like we have in HSR, and no missing parts of character kits like you have in ZZZ.
And now, we're seeing something even worse. Something developers have begun implementing only recently, purposely creating characters that—
in my opinion, if weapons were created well, it could have easily been the one thing that limits power creep in any game. Jane from ZZZ can use Alice's weapon, which will most likely push her damage up by around 30% even without optimal play. That by itself gives me some concerns because Jane isn't even a year old yet. First thing is like, why would Jane need a buff this big less than a year since her release? And it's sort of just like, oh my gosh, would we even need to worry about this power creep in the first place if there weren't ball-busting characters like Miyabi ever released at all in the state that they're in? So I agree that yes, weapons can help out a lot in terms of like equalizing the playing field between older and newer units. It's just, I wouldn't rely on them this much when the power creep is happening this fast. Because as far as I'm concerned, yeah, Jane might actually be one of the worst 5-star characters in the game right now, right?
Purposely creating characters that are gated from previously strong free-to-play options. To elaborate, in Honkai Star Rail and ZZZ, this manifests in the creation of new weapon categories.
Remembrance and Rupture.
HSR and ZZZ, versions 3.0 and 2.0 respectively, added the Remembrance path and the Rupture agent type. Since these classifications were completely new, you were unable to use any of the previously existing light cones or W engines, gating weapons that would have been solid choices. In HSR, the new path made especially little sense. The new mechanic featured with the Remembrance was arguably not innovative enough to warrant the creation of a new path, as well as the fact that each newly released Remembrance character could have easily belonged to a different path. Aglaya was functionally identical to a Destruction unit, Casterus in Erudition, and Hyacinth in Abundance. However, they could not access the light cones associated with those paths simply because of the new system.
And you want to know what? All 3 of those characters are Remembrance when they all deal damage in so many different fucking ways. One of them heals, but is also Remembrance. The other one deals, like, follow-up damage. Oh, but they're Remembrance too. The other one deals AoE on every single attack. Yeah, they're Remembrance as well. And at some point, you just have to ask yourself, what was the point of this path other than to just sell new stuff?
It would be a different story if Hoyoverse released a plethora of good non-limited light cones, but it has been 4 months since Aglaya's release, and there has yet to be a gacha cone that surpasses even the 3-star cone. Casterus and Yishren, on the other hand, have such an atrocious collection of non-paid weapons that their next best, and very noticeably worse, choices are weapons from a completely different path just for the base stats on them.
Imagine that the Rupture classes W engines are so bad that 5-star W engines from a different specialty that have no effect, they're literally just attack and crit stat sticks, are performing better than S5 versions of the Rupture weapons. Literal stat sticks are better. Good God. It's the same thing for Casterus too, by the way, guys. You see Time Waits for No One? That's Bailu's light cone. The Abundance character, that is literally her 3rd best option on Casterus. You can see that this is clearly not a good practice. It's probably not a good practice to have the 2nd and 3rd best slots for a character be a weapon outside of their class just for the base stats, right? ZZZ did this a year into their launch. They needed to pressure their player base into pulling for a new weapon a year into launch this much by making the other options this fucking bad. You have to be wondering to yourself, why is this happening? Why does there need to be this much of a need to sell things to players?
This is completely unreasonable and has never been the case for any previous character. Wuthering Waves isn't innocent either. Far from it. Let's take the latest characters, Chacona and Cardathea, who were tailor-made for each other. Chacona and Cardathea are gun and sword users respectively, which initially sounded promising as those 2 weapon types had the best accessible non-limited alternatives.
True. Emerald of Genesis and Static Mist.
That being Static Mist for the gun and Emerald of Genesis for the sword. These 2 weapons were reliable, having been sufficient alternatives for most gun and sword users due to their rare crit rate stats and universally desired attack buffing. Static Mist was especially notable on supportive gun units, like Chacona, due to the fact that it could increase your main DPS's attack. However, all of this was rendered irrelevant by a single aspect of Cardathea's kit. She was an HP scaler. Attack was effectively useless on her. This meant that she couldn't benefit from Static Mist's buff, nor the high base attack and attack buffing from Emerald of Genesis. If you wanted to make Chacona and Cardathea function properly as a team, you now had to pull for both of their signature weapons.
And unfortunately, this is where the argument starts falling apart. This idea that the characters aren't functional without their weapons is a bit of a miss. For Chacona, you still have amazing stats at a baseline for her to work with when she's on Static Mist. So let's just clarify this part of the argument over here, because I can understand what she's saying. If you don't have Chacona's signature, you're missing out on some decent stuff, right? You're missing out on a good bit of personal damage, 24% arrow, and then you're missing out on a 10% arrow resistant shred on the enemies, right? Chacona already has a lot of baseline arrow damage buffs like built into her kit, and so essentially, if you don't have Chacona's weapon, you lose out on some personal damage, and you lose out on some of her buffing ability. Which is, I mean, at a baseline, not like the craziest thing ever. When you go ahead and you go over to Static Mist, though, you're getting some benefits. You get benefits from Chakona simply wielding this weapon that you don't get with her signature. And that is a whopping massive ER substat, and unfortunately, this attack buff doesn't work in the Chakona Kartithia teams. But this ER substat alone, followed by a whopping 24.3% crit rate, it's 12% at R1, by the way, makes it so that the character is literally easier to build. Simply having this weapon, which everyone is basically guaranteed to have, based off of the way that the standard banner works, lets you just use this weapon on this character and then fulfill 2/3 of your ER requirement, making her way easier to build and actually slot into the teams. It's actually harder to balance her echoes and roll them properly and make her functional using her signature compared to the standard weapon. And with these big base stats that are fully applicable, as well as a useful weapon effect, the only thing you're not getting is its attack buff, because you will get it, but Kartithia simply won't use it. And then when it comes to Kartithia and how her signature works, right? A lot of people are unhappy by the fact, right, that this weapon over here is one of the only HP scaling weapons in the game. But you want to know what this weapon doesn't provide? I'll tell you what this weapon doesn't provide. I don't see the word crit rate anywhere on here. I don't see the word crit damage anywhere on here. All I see are personal damage buffs for Kartithia. And you want to know what Emerald of Genesis provides? Alrighty, it's got crit. It's actually got a lot of crit. It's got 24.3% crit. Kuro Games could have easily balanced this weapon, or really unbalanced this weapon, in a way where it was indisputably the best option for Kartithia, right? Under any circumstance, under any situation. Imagine if it had a crit substat instead, and then way more HP buffs in here. It would functionally be the same thing, but way more powerful. But because this weapon doesn't give crit, you need to have some insane fucking echo rolls. And you also need to have a very specific combination of echoes to actually make the character deal damage. It's really hard to build the character around these. And when you have Emerald of Genesis, it's literally easier to build the character. Yes, you don't deal as much damage because, well, you won't be able to use the attack buff, but you are really able to use the ER buff that this weapon has. Her weapon doesn't give ER, and you want like 120%. And you can see over here the increase in critical rate that I just got from simply switching the weapon. It's so big that you can also run a different echo profile, where I would just change this one to critical damage instead of critical rate if I wanted to optimize with Emerald of Genesis. The signature weapons do give you more damage, like every signature weapon in the game, and I would hope a character's performance on their signature weapon is the highest, but there's still benefits to running the standard ones. And functionally, literally, what you're missing is more damage, which is kind of the case in the first place when you're skipping a signature. And again, with either of these two characters' weapons, you're not like removing a key ability in their kit. You're just losing enhancements to what already exists as their key ability. So that's where I think the argument falls apart. That's just my take. Let's hear a little bit more about what they think about Chakona and Kartithia.
One to provide a usable buff, and the other to give Kartithia the stats she actually needs. And this is still ignoring the raw difference in damage between Chakona's weapon choices. In conclusion, this leads to very polarizing results between having signature weapons and not.
I'm struggling to read what's on here. All the labels are like a little bit different. Maybe she'll explain
Having
them.
signature weapons and not. More so than we've ever seen before in Wuthering Waves.
Graph of weapon damage differences. Okay, I'm gonna be real here. I don't think anyone sees what's going on in here either.
However, to be fair, the problem could be alleviated if there were other options that fulfilled the purpose of the limited weapons, but that is a separate issue that could deserve its own video.
Yeah, so I think the main thing is that across this chart, people have looked at the data, and the main things is that I think it's Brant who's skewing the results the most, where Brant's kind of coming in with a very unique stat profile, and, well, you require a different echo set to build him optimally with a different type of weapon. And so these comparisons at a baseline, you would probably need at least 3 different inputs for Brant for it to like actually make sense. And it's showing like a condensed overview. I guess the main thing is that the trend is that it's going up in terms of like what the actual damage increases are. it has like Biz to standard, Biz to 4-star, and then like standard to 4-star. And I think the main thing is that standard to 4-star is not changing. And they want you to focus on Biz to standard and Biz to 4-star. And the thing is that, well, these numbers don't look that crazy. There's only 2 outliers on here. They don't look that crazy. Like, especially if you look at this stuff over here, there's like 2 values that are kind of going a little bit out of whack, but the rest of them are staying quite literally at the same levels. And your results are going to be skewed as well because of how good the standard pistol is and how good the standard sword is. Where sword users are going to have a lower gap because of the built-in crit, pistol users are going to have a lower gap because of the built-in crit, and then all the other weapon types, right? Your broad blades, etc., your gauntlets, they're not going to be performing as well from the signature to standard debate because these are the substats. They give attack main stats for all the other standard weapons that aren't swords or pistols. So I think that chart at a baseline definitely needs like a bit of a grain of salt and some additional context for you to be able to make like a full, not too crazy take about it. That's my point of view. I think that this one definitely should be taken with a grain of salt because as you look over here, right, they're pretty close to a same level and they're also drawing a lot of comparisons with weapons that unfortunately have some bad standard options and then relating them to like a Camellia or a Chang Li who have great standard options.
The problem could be alleviated if there were other options that fulfilled the purpose of the limited weapons, but that is a separate issue that could deserve its own video. No matter the method, the end result is the same. Without signature weapons, characters feel underwhelming at best, if not just outright terrible, leading to polarizing results between owning and not owning the SIG.
I think the main thing to really get down into when it comes to signature weapons is that if they don't feel required to clear the content, then there's inherently no actual real issue with them. My point of view is that when content in Wuthering Waves is entirely 1000%, actually, frankly, easily doable with 4-star alternatives and 4-star weapons, and then pulling a character and then pulling their signature is what makes the game like an absolute cakewalk in terms of the end game, then it's not really that much of an issue. Functionally, in a lot of ways, people are pulling their signatures and pulling these weapons to somewhat play the game less because their clears are going to take less time. However, when you have games like your ZZZs, your Genshins, your so on and so forth, and your HSRs, where the HP inflation is getting to such a high degree, where suddenly now pulling the SIG feels like it's becoming more and more necessary to be able to clear, then that's where the issue actually starts becoming very, very, very real. But until Wuthering Waves reaches that point, which frankly I don't think it will because it's been a year and then the HP inflation and the power creep has been really well managed, then I don't really think it's a problem. But don't worry, if Kuro Games starts coming out with stupid ass content like Stygian Onslaught, which requires you literally to have multiple dupes of units to feel like you even stand a chance of clearing certain types of content, we'll be the first to call it out. But for now, when the difference between having a SIG and not is like 10 to 15 seconds on a clear, and you're already 30 seconds faster than what you need to actually get your full stars, I mean, at that point, I don't think it can functionally mean that much.
This extreme dichotomy might even lead players that can't afford to spend lots of real money to skip entire characters they would have otherwise gotten.
And once again, if your endgame content isn't balanced around you having a character plus their signature, and it's instead balanced around you having like a character plus the standard option, or a character and a 4-star weapon, you should theoretically never actually feel that pressure to go ahead, pull weapons, do all of that stuff. Because you literally don't need it, and you're pulling it mainly for collection purposes, or to just get the shiniest numbers possible. Weapons in Wuthering Waves literally feel cosmetic. They literally just feel cosmetic because weapons won't be the difference between you clearing and not clearing. It'll just make you clear faster if you're already clearing.
Personally, this was the deciding factor why I didn't pull Hugo Vlad. The sheer difference in numbers was too much for me to justify getting him. Now, some will argue that these problems are overblown, as even without their signature weapon, most characters can still clear the endgame content in their respective games just fine.
Yeah, not an HSR. Don't worry. it might seem like that in HSR. It might seem like that in ZZZ. It might seem like that in Genshin. It will not be like that for much longer. Unless you're actually going to play like a top 1% player. And in Honkai Star Rail, there's no like skill. It's just a button presses in order, that sort of stuff. So in HSR, that's why it's become abundantly clear how underpowered some units are, because there's not that skill element in there. But when it comes to ZZZ and when it comes to Genshin Impact, don't worry, the cracks are already showing. The cracks are already there.
It will just take a bit of extra effort. However, this notion completely misses the point. Players should not feel as if they're missing part of their character if they opt to skip their weapon, especially given how expensive the character is by themselves. Not getting that one-turn ultimate as Rappa feels terrible. Having to reset the run because your Zenless missed the crit due to a missing Sig is irritating. Witnessing Evelyn's chain attacks hit significantly weaker than they should is unsatisfying.
My point of view is, if it feels like part of your kit is missing, that sucks on a weapon. Similarly, if the only thing that changes from you not having a weapon is that your numbers aren't as high, I don't think that's as big of an issue. I think the example of you losing a team-wide, losing like a specific mechanic like defense shred, or losing certain attacks in your kit, blah, 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 all of that, that's a problem. But if your crit rate isn't as high, your base attack isn't as high, so on and so forth, I mean, that's kind of the situation when it comes to signatures and when it comes to a weapon system like this. And so I think that the only way for that to be remedied and to be rectified is for a game not to have like a weapon system in the first place. But that's a different discussion to have overall. But when it comes to like an overall weapon system as a whole, it provides, at a baseline, right, unique ways for you to slot out various members of the roster where, you know, especially on like a sub DPS unit, you can decide, okay, I'm going to take a big hit on my overall damage so that I can do a faster rotation. That's why I'm going to slot in a weapon like Cadenza instead of maybe like Woodland Aria. Or I'm going to go ahead and put in Cadenza because I'm using Kachona to support Spectral Frazzle team. And so her arrow damage doesn't matter that much, and the arrow buffs don't matter that much. So I'm going to use like a Static Mist or a Cadenza instead. I think that they provide like strategic depth to a degree, especially if you're sliding characters in different team compositions. And it's about simply having more interesting weapon types in the game that'll let some characters, you know, take on some of those roles. And so I do think that one very valid point of critique, I'm not sure if it's mentioned in the video, is simply having like more fun or nuanced weapon options available in Wuthering Waves. And I think Cadenza, like the whole Concerto class series, is an awesome example of the potential that's out there, where you trade damage for additional utility. And that's where I've actually come out with the suggestion that there should be like some 4-star weapons, or maybe even some 5-star weapons that have like debuff effects, right? Something that like a weapon that applies like an elemental status, a spectral frazzle, an arrow erosion, an electro flare, a fusion burst, weapons that do that sort of stuff just to be able to, you know, provide like that additional flavor and that additional depth in the character building. Could be something really interesting for Kuro to explore.
It has become a point where not having a character sig greatly affects the experience of playing said character. Furthermore, it's worth mentioning that there are also instances where a character struggles to clear at all without their signature, but in my opinion, this is more of a power creep issue than the weapon system's fault.
I think the take itself that, you know, a character is going to feel like less without their weapon, I mean, yeah, it is what it is. I don't think anyone can disagree with that. The main focus is on the extent to which they don't feel like a full character without their sig. If the end result is like a couple of percentage points on the outputted damage, and then it's mostly entirely just raw stat buffs that you're getting, not that big of a deal. But when you're in the entire realm of missing pieces of a kit, I think that's a bigger issue.
Okay, what now? How should these games fix their weapon system? Is it possible to design a non-predatory, free-to-play signature weapon? Well, as established before, non-predatory signature weapons don't exist.
If I could rank 2 weapons that I would remove, it would probably be Phoebe's signature. I think I would remove Phoebe's signature, and that would be the main one. Yeah, I think this would be the one that I would remove. I don't think Chacona's is that bad because it's just a general arrow buff. I don't think Lupa's is that bad because it's just a general fusion buff. I think Phoebe's needs to be removed I would remove it because it only amplifies spectral frazzle damage. And so Phoebe's signature effectively, well, at least half of its effect, it only works on Zani and no other character. This works with every arrow character. This works with every fusion character. However, you do have the flip side of this weapon is also a dual purpose one and works when Phoebe is a DPS as well. And so it's almost like one half of this weapon is completely useless if you don't play the right Phoebe mode. Like if you're DPS Phoebe, this second half of the effect that amplifies spectral frazzle damage might as well not exist. On the other hand, if you're playing sub DPS Phoebe, then this half of the weapon that increases your attack and then gives you basic and heavy attack damage, it literally does nothing. So it's kind of like there's reasons why and why not for the weapon being good, but I would say this has to be the most problematic one in the game. But even with it being this problematic, it's still like balanced, if that makes sense, because Confession Phoebe literally does no damage at all.
That's like the idea of a non-predatory trillion-dollar company. The concept itself is predatory, incentivizing profit maximization at the expense of the consumer. However, it's not like Hoyoverse and Kuro Games can simply throw away this core part of the game system.
And I think we already listed the examples of where the weapon system can actually provide a lot of value. I just hope that Kuro does something more to flesh it out even further.
If a gacha game must or insist on implementing signature weapons, what should they do to make these weapons at least reasonable? There's no perfect way to define a reasonable signature weapon, but a good rule of thumb is that its performance does not differ drastically from a free-to-play or at minimum, non-limited gacha option. As an example, let's take Jingren's signature light cone. Now, what this light cone does is that it increases Jingren's damage. What? You expected it to do something else? Maybe because nowadays signature light cones consist of perks such as advancing your action forward, inflicting debuffs, filling up your energy for otherwise impossible to reach breakpoints, giving stats unobtainable elsewhere, skill point generation, taunt value increase, and much more.
And what you'll notice, right, is that at a baseline, Wuthering Waves' weapons, even Phoebe's, every single weapon in this game is really just a combination of deal damage. That's it. This weapon, deal more damage, or buff a character to deal more damage. Deal more damage, 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 and let other teammates deal more damage, deal more damage, deal more damage. Increase your healing, and then deal more damage, deal damage, more damage, more damage, more damage for you, and then more damage for the team, and then more damage and more damage. That's it. That is functionally every weapon in Wuthering Waves, every single signature. Deal more damage, or buff members of the team to deal more damage. Not any of that other wild shit that was just described over here. Because those character kits, Acheron without her light cone, put the fries in the bag, little pup.
On the other hand, Jingren's signature weapon is one I would deem healthy for the game, as it merely provides a damage increase, and not by too much compared to free-to-play or 4-star options. Additionally, Jingren's light cone was universally strong, at least at its time. You could use it on any release date Erudition character for a marginal increase, and even save it for future limited Erudition characters due to its flexibility.
Kind of like how Stringmaster right now is usable on pretty much every single rectifier. Some characters like their signature a lot more than Stringmaster, and that's because of how Stringmaster's activation requires resonant skill damage to work.
Which, in a way, allowed you to get away with saving your pulls by skipping future weapons. This allowed the light cone to still benefit the player, while also remaining far from a necessity. Alright, so what should we make of all this? At the end of the day, signature weapons are just part of a plethora of issues present in modern gacha games, and they may only get worse from here. From a consumer perspective, the only way to push for meaningful change is through collective recognition and feedback. Unfortunately, gacha communities also have a reputation of tolerating, if not outright defending, predatory practices.
This is my take on this entire, on the way that signature weapons have evolved. I think that the ship has frankly sailed when it comes to Honkai Star Rail. I think the fact that everybody went ahead, they had the design of Acheron's light cone, where literally her ability to cast her ultimate is impacted by whether or not you have her light cone. They bought the fuck out of it, made it one of the best-selling banners ever, and then Honkai Star Rail has decided not to look back ever since. And they've kept doing it over and over and over and over and over again. ZZZ has also done the same thing since release. They have had some of the most tailored weapons in the space when it comes to how they work, and they are literally locking behind a essential part of a character's kit behind whether or not they have their weapon. And they've also introduced a whole new class of character on top of it, while also having hyper-specific weapon effects. In Genshin Impact, of course, they've started releasing more and more weapons that have specific taglines. Half of the weapons released in that land have like a tagline that requires you to like activate Night Soul, which is like, okay, like 10 characters on the roster have Night Soul. So like, okay, you literally can't use this weapon's effect on other characters. And then Skirk's signature, which just released, requires you to have 0 energy to activate its crit damage effect. Within 12 seconds after an elemental skill is used, attack is increased by 24%. During this time, when the equipping character has 0 energy, attack will be further increased by 24%, and crit damage will be increased by 40%. Every unit in Genshin Impact, after using their elemental burst, they regenerate a set amount of energy. This bonus over here is impossible to be used by any character except Skirk, because Mavuika is currently the only other one with 0 energy, and she's a Claymore user. So that is how specific the Genshin weapons have gotten. That is how specific they've gotten with their weapon effects. I do think, though, that overall, Genshin is probably the best. Ironically enough, I think Genshin's weapon system is ironically the best, despite it having the worst banner. They have taken the balancing right. They're pushing the boundaries, but in relation to like your HSRs or your Genshin or your ZZZs, Genshin actually does weapons the best in terms of like having the free-to-play options and all of that. And so as long as Wuthering Waves sticks with its philosophy of we just make the character deal more damage, or we increase the character's supporting ability by letting their teammates do more damage across their signatures, I don't think it's that bad of a deal. Because at the very least, yes, some of Wuwa's weapons are a little bit specific, but the performance gap between having a hyper-specific weapon and not is super damn low in actual practice. And yes, that Chakota team she was talking about before, it looks like it has some really big gaps. That is because Chakota actually deals a lot more damage than people think. And her weapon is a little bit busted on her. I would just say as a whole, definitely some good points raised up. Definitely some decent discussion being had in this video. We stretched this one out for quite a while, but I think it was a good opportunity for us to do a good bit of like a breakdown of the balancing that's been done behind the scenes for all of these games. Signature weapons aren't the best thing ever. They're not that great of an addition to a game, but they also do provide, the weapon system itself provides an opportunity. And I think it's about how devs use that creativity to move forward. It's clear that in HSR and ZZZ, that creativity's been squandered. In Genshin Impact, it's been explored a little bit. And I think in Wuthering Waves, they just need to push a little bit farther to see where it goes. That'll be that. Let me know what you all think. Peace.